World War III is looming large on the horizon, but without nukes, who comes out on top? If the doomsday clock strikes midnight and nuclear weapons are somehow off the table, the battlefield changes dramatically. So which nation dominates the world in a war of tanks, troops, and tactics? Find out on today's episode of the Infographic Show. If nukes didn't exist, this country would win all wars. With unmatched military spending and a near-perfect geographic position, the US is built to dominate a world without nukes. But it hasn't always been this way. America's military dominance is actually a recent development. If we had played out this exact scenario during most of the Cold War, the winner would definitely have not been America. In fact, it was the US who planned to use nuclear weapons in the opening days of World War III because it knew it was vastly outmatched in muscle by the Soviet Union. In fact, when it came to conventional power, the Soviets significantly outmatched the US and its NATO allies. In the 1950s, NATO enjoyed a technological edge, but that gap closed fast. By the 1960s, the Soviet Union had not only caught up, its conventional strength kept growing from there. The Soviets would hit their peak in the 1970s, with around 4 million Soviet personnel and a 3-to-1 advantage in tanks. The massive disparity in ground combat power was directly related to the success of the Soviet Army in World War II. There was a great emphasis placed on tank warfare, to the point that dozens of infantry regiments were slashed after the war to convert them to tank regiments. At that same time, the United States military was experiencing a deep decline after the debacle that was Vietnam. The US morale was low, equipment was outdated, and it was feared that the Soviets would take advantage of the situation to strike while America was at its weakest. To this end, the US beefed up its nuclear forces as a deterrent, knowing that if they had to wage conventional war, it would mean disaster for NATO. But everything changed in the 1980s. President Reagan launched a massive military buildup, which paved the way for US conventional superiority. The Reagan Doctrine championed peace through strength, with Reagan commenting that wars came not when the forces of freedom were strong, but when they were weak. Reagan went on a silent offensive, increasing the size of the US Army by 2 entire divisions and launching his famous Strategic Defense Initiative, a program publicly meant to protect the US from nuclear weapons. The US's biggest military revolution didn't come from expanding its size, though, but billions of dollars in investments into new weapon systems. Things like GPS and precision-guided bombs revolutionized warfare and were brandished to deadly effect during Desert Storm. Soviet observers carefully watching the US-led operation hurried back to Moscow in a panic. It's claimed that one observed the only way to stop a US attack would be with nuclear weapons. The tables had finally turned. Just like the Soviet Union at its prime, America has the strongest military in the world, but can it really win any war in the world? Well, yes, but not for the reason you think. First, let's talk geography. When it came to location, the US couldn't have hoped for a better one. Its only shared borders are 2 much weaker, friendlier powers that have a deep economic and defense partnership with America. Canada, the only American neighbor that could offer any real military resistance, is itself deeply devoted to shared North American security. Historically, in the post-war period, Canada has been a steadfast ally of the US and a reliable partner. In a dangerous world, America is well and truly secure, with no threat of a surprise attack. If any nation tries, they're going to have to cross 2 oceans to do it, and the US Navy and Air Force are going to see them coming from a long way away. The key to modern success in warfare is air power. Cheap drones may grab headlines, and they've achieved surprising results against better-equipped foes, but when it comes to real dominance, conventional air forces still rule the skies. The US brings a grand total of just over 13,000 aircraft, and surprisingly, only about 5,000 aircraft are combat aircraft. But that's actually the secret to America's success. The Russian inventory includes 34% combat aircraft, though take that percentage with a grain of salt due to their battlefield losses. The Chinese, meanwhile, devote nearly half of their air forces to combat duties. So how can the US possibly be the dominant power when it devotes less of its fleet to combat duties than its competitors? The secret is in the mix, and it separates amateurs from professional war observers. In the US inventory, a full tenth of all aircraft, over 1,000, are special mission airframes. These are everything from AWACS to electronic warfare aircraft who never fire a single weapon in combat, but are directly responsible for America's airborne lethality. With cutting-edge sensors, they can peer deep into enemy territory to spot and track threats, feeding targeted information to friendly aircraft and giving them a look-first, shoot-first capability. Other aircraft can hoover up vast amounts of electronic data to paint a picture of the electronic environment, and then scramble it into nonsense like shaking an Etch-a-Sketch. Just ask the Chinese. During Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, secret U.S. aircraft shadowed her flight, disrupting Chinese sensors so thoroughly that they were unable to track or target a slow, lumbering transport just over 100 miles off their own shore. The incident caused such a stir with the Chinese that they immediately plowed billions into electronic warfare. If a similar incident occurred during open hostilities with the U.S., it would have been disastrous. Amateurs will discuss fighter jets and bombers, while professionals are going to want to know where the support assets are. What's their readiness and capabilities? And this includes cargo aircraft, which are crucial for U.S. force projection all around the world. It's the secret to U.S. global capabilities, a fleet of nearly 1,000 transport aircraft, the largest logistics air fleet anywhere in the world. These unsung heroes may not fly flashy stealth jets, but without them, forward-deployed F-22s, F-35s, and TR-3Bs are going to sit on the front line without munitions, spare parts, or maintenance personnel to service them. Special mission aircraft also give the U.S. Air Force and Navy its legs. Its fleet of over 600 aerial refuelers is the largest in the world. They're directly responsible for the ability to put warheads anywhere in the world within 24 hours. When the United States struck Iran's nuclear facilities, the B-2 was the hero of the day. But the real heroes were the air crews delivering gas to the stealth bombers over 6 different times on their flight to and from the combat theater. Without refuelers, your combat aircraft's ranges are reduced to a few hundred miles. This is a problem with basically every military in the world that isn't the U.S. China, for example, would be hard-pressed to deliver a sizable strike package across the Pacific, given its tiny fleet of only about 30 tankers. Mobility and awareness are the greatest capabilities that America's air forces bring to the fight, even more so than actual combat power. And this logistics overmatch is why the U.S. simply can't lose a conventional war. If you can't move combat power across 2 oceans, you are simply never going to threaten the U.S. But the moment that you try, you're going to be up against some of the best combat aircraft in the world. The F-47 will be joining the fray soon, and the B-21 Raider is nearly ready to bring its wrath to a battlefield near you. And this makes the United States the only nation with a solid lead on implementing 6th-generation aircraft into its inventory anytime soon. Even without their support fleet, the F-35 and F-22 showcased their dominance in June 2025, flying cover for B-2 stealth bombers over Iran's heavily defended skies. They penetrated hostile airspace, and they made it out without a single loss. Not only does the U.S. Navy operate the 2nd-largest air force in the world, for a total of over 3,700 aircraft, but its ships are amongst the most advanced in the world. Notice that we said amongst the most advanced, not the most advanced. Now, it's no secret that the U.S. ships remain significantly deadly, with more battle force missiles and total tonnage than even China's explosively growing navy. But China's Type 55 destroyer is a monster of a ship, with more modern equipment than its Arleigh Burke counterparts. The Navy has been in dire need of a modern replacement, which is years behind schedule. Russia might be struggling in many military arenas, but under the waves, it's a different story. The crown jewel is the Yasin-class submarines. It's so advanced that some in the U.S. defense establishment believe the newest models may outclass even America's Virginia-class subs. That doesn't mean that the U.S. naval forces are a slouch, though, because they're not. With 11 supercarriers, the U.S. Navy packs more air power than entire countries combined. And under the waves, U.S. submarines may be showing their age, but still remain a formidable and deadly silent service. Arleigh Burkes are getting long in the tooth, but even they have some of the most advanced air defense capabilities in the world. The Navy's biggest concern is its shipbuilding, which is America's Achilles heel. If it wasn't for overwhelming U.S. air power, this could be a very different video. There's a famous saying when it comes to naval warfare: you build the Navy for tomorrow's war today. Warships take years to design and build, so you can't just slap together a fleet when conflict starts. In fact, nearly half of the ships built during World War II weren't ready for fighting the Japanese. They were to replace losses and shape the post-war Navy. Wartime needs are urgent, but naval planning demands foresight. In April 2025, the Government Accountability Office issued a report with the headline, "U.S. Navy Shipbuilding is consistently over budget and delayed, despite billions invested in industry." Every major class of ship in the U.S. Navy is facing delays, and we're not talking a few weeks. The Virginia-class submarines and Constellation-class frigates are the worst offenders, currently running a full 36 months behind schedule. And this is despite doubling the investment in U.S. shipbuilding over the last 20 years. The culprit is the end of the Cold War. The U.S. got out of the shipbuilding game Because the ships the US primarily built were warships no longer needed. Civilian shipbuilding has been largely overtaken by countries like South Korea and China, where lower labor costs and state-backed industrial strategies allow them to churn out ships faster and cheaper than the US ever could. To put it bluntly, the United States will not be able to recover its losses after a major naval war. The US is on track to hit a $1 trillion military budget, and a big chunk of that is going to the Army. While the US Air Force and Navy fend off any attacks on the homeland before they can even reach the shore, the Army has the job of being on the front line. America's fleets of Abrams tanks has proven on the battlefields of Ukraine to still be a significant threat, even when stripped out of their top-secret components and armor for foreign use. Russia made a bunch of fanfare about destroying the last Abrams that was supplied to Ukraine, proclaiming it as a victory, while ignoring the fact that it took them over a year to destroy the 31 sent by America. At that rate, it would take Russia 150 years to eliminate America's fleet of over 4,600 Abrams tanks. But these Abrams will actually be wearing their top-secret armor and their sensor packages. But what about the drones? They have stolen the spotlight in Ukraine, striking targets with precision and altering the pace of battle. But don't take that as proof that drones have replaced tanks altogether. The truth is, Ukraine's war has bogged down into a grinding stalemate, and in the kind of static warfare drones thrive. America's highly integrated combined arms approach to warfare makes it extremely unlikely that it too would get bogged down to the point that drones became the dominant weapon. Add in the growing number of drone defenses, and there's an argument to be made that US forces will not have the same experience as Ukrainian or Russian forces. Backing up the Abrams is the now world-famous Bradley. When it first premiered, NATO observers actually mocked it, mostly because of how tall it stood. Then, it defeated Iraq's relatively modern Soviet-provided armored forces. After seeing Bradleys take anti-tank missiles and protect their entire crew in Ukraine, or face off against T-92 tanks and win, nobody is mocking it. In fact, they're placing orders for Bradleys for all of their own militaries even as the US looks at a future replacement. Surprisingly though, despite having almost 392,000 vehicles in its inventory, only about 14% are combat vehicles. The rest are engineering and utility vehicles. Everything from mining or demining vehicles to battlefield salvage and engineering. And once again, the US proves that superiority doesn't come just from how much bang you have, but rather from the ability to employ it intelligently. Just like in the Air Force and Navy, the Army's host of logisticians and engineers are the true combat aces. But what about other contenders? Let's imagine that the US disappeared. Could anyone really become war-proof, winning any war they entered? Russia's 3-day operation to seize Kyiv is now well into its 3rd year, so they're probably not a good candidate. The nation's biggest problem isn't just massive levels of corruption that have gutted its military, but geography is actively working against it. Historically, Russia has been invaded time and time again due to the fact that it sits on the European plain, and it has no defensible features to stop an enemy army with. This is why after World War II, the Soviets were adamant about establishing the Soviet bloc. The situation in the east is actually better for Russia. Here, networks of rivers and marshlands combined with tall mountains actually make for formidable barriers against the only nation that could feasibly invade its borders, China. Today, Russia is overstretched, but if Russian troops were freed from the Ukrainian quagmire, they could put up a stubborn defense in the east to a Chinese attack, without resorting to nuclear weapons. But if Russia has proven anything, it is simply not competent enough to take on a major global power like China. So what about China then? Could it become a global superpower without the US? China ticks almost all the boxes. It has a huge population and huge industry to support it. It's geographically naturally protected from attack on all fronts. Vast deserts and rugged mountains form natural barriers against Russian advances in the north and the west. Meanwhile, the Himalayas shield its southern border from India. China forcibly taking Tibet was no accident. The illegal annexation was meant to deny Tibet as a staging ground to Indian forces, but it also was to secure the headwaters of the many rivers that China relies on. Now, instead, China is within striking range of the headwaters that feed India's rivers. Calculating China's total military budget is difficult because the raw figure doesn't really tell us the truth. Salaries and manufacturing costs are cheaper in China than the US, so relying on raw numbers is useless. A better metric is purchasing power parity, a direct comparison of what it actually costs to buy things in China versus the US. Experts differ here as well, with some claiming that when adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP, China only spends a quarter as much as the US on military. others argue that it spends more. A reasonable estimate that cuts through Chinese economic data manipulation is probably closer to somewhere around 60%. But despite it spending less, it's getting quite a lot of bang for its buck with an explosion in naval power, critical to global war success. China's total tonnage and, a better measure, battle force missiles lags about 30% behind the US, but unlike America, the Chinese Navy is actually growing. China has 13 shipyards capable of building large military vessels, compared to America's 4. Outside of the US, China's unique geography and strong economy poses it as the nation most likely to defeat all others in the war. Its only real Achilles heel is its dependence on imported oil, with supply lines running across the Indian Ocean where India can easily interdict them. Yet, Chinese naval technology and capabilities is growing much faster than India, and there is an alternate solution. Without the fear of nukes and its flanks completely secure, China could focus most of its military into a push north into Russia's energy-rich Far East. There's already a great deal of political pressure to at least demand parts of the Russian Far East, stolen from China in unfair treaties forced upon them by the Russian czars. This constant tension is why leaked documents show that the Russian government, despite relying on China for its Ukraine war effort, still considers China an enemy and a threat to its sovereignty. This is why Russia held nuclear exercises in the region just a few years ago. Without its nukes to fall back on, though, Russian forces would likely be overwhelmed by a superior equipped Chinese military. Then again, the Chinese haven't waged a war since the late 70s against a weakened Vietnam, and they lost that war. For much of its modern history, China's military doctrine was modeled on Soviet and Russian principles. It was only in the last decade that they began to unify their military commands to enable combined arms effects. Another factor working against China is the dual chains of command within its military, one military and the other political. Each Chinese unit is commanded by both a military and political officer, and Chinese soldiers must dedicate a significant amount of their training time to political education. Military service in China is also far less favorable than in most other countries. Chinese parents see the military as a low-class career and prefer their children pursue academic pursuits. Academics are seen as more prestigious and respectable than the more brutish soldier class, a historical legacy that lasts to this day but was made worse by the one-child policies. With only one child, typically a son, to raise, few Chinese parents wanted them to waste their time in the military. This has deeply affected Chinese military leaders, as these little emperors who were allowed to join the military now reach the senior-most command levels. But can they actually command? That remains the question. However, if China can overcome these challenges, we are confident that in a world where the US doesn't exist, China just might be the only other nation incapable of losing a war. Take the nukes out of the picture and the US military would still steamroll the competition. But how much do you know about them? Watch Insane Facts You Never Knew About the US Military for intel that'll blow your mind, or click on this video instead.